When we think about the American Civil War, we picture epic battles, solemn speeches, and grainy black and white photos. But buried beneath all that drama is a goldmine of pure absurdity. This war wasn't just bloody, it was baffling. From armies fighting over bacon and shoes to generals obsessed with beards and buttons, here are 44 of the dumbest, weirdest, and flat-out funniest things that actually happened during America's deadliest sibling rivalry. 1. Meet Wilmer McLean, arguably the most statistically unlucky man in American history. He wasn't a soldier or a politician. He was just a wholesale grocer who wanted some peace and quiet. The first major land battle of the war, the First Battle of Bull Run, broke out on his farm in 1861, with a cannonball famously crashing into his fireplace. Utterly fed up, he moved his family 120 miles south to a sleepy, unknown little town called Appomattox Courthouse to escape the war for good. The universe's punchline? 4 years later, General Robert E. Lee formally surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in Wilmer McLean's new living room. The war literally used his private property as bookends, proving that sometimes history has your address and it will find you. 2. One of the most pivotal battles in world history, Gettysburg, didn't begin with some grand strategic maneuver. It began with a desperate shopping trip. A Confederate division marched towards the small town of Gettysburg based on a persistent rumor that a large supply of shoes was stored in a warehouse there. Many of the soldiers were marching barefoot and were desperate for footwear. This hunt for boots accidentally collided with a Union cavalry unit, sparking a skirmish that spiraled into the 3-day battle that changed the course of the entire war. It's like launching a war over a pair of socks and finishing it in a stranger's kitchen. 3. This wasn't just a battle cry. It was a weapon of psychological terror. The Confederate rebel yell was a high-pitched, unnerving shriek that was described by Union soldiers as a mix between a coyote's howl and a banshee's wail. Union troops, who were accustomed to a deep, orderly huzzah or hurrah, were completely horrified by this inhuman, keening sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It created the terrifying impression that they weren't being charged by an army of men, but by a horde of deranged madmen from the very depths of the wilderness. It was pure sonic warfare designed to make you question your enemy's sanity, and it worked beautifully. 4. When you're running low on cannons, you get creative. Confederate forces became masters of battlefield deception by inventing Quaker guns. They would take ordinary logs, chop them to resemble cannons, paint them black, and mount them in fortifications to look like heavy artillery from a distance. Union scouts would spot these heavily armed positions and report back, often causing entire attacks to be delayed or canceled out of fear. Entire defensive lines were successfully held by nothing more than painted lumber and audacious bluffing. It was the 19th century equivalent of putting fake security cameras on your house to deter burglars, and it was shockingly effective. 5. The iconic star-crossed Confederate battle flag wasn't their original national banner. Their first flag, the Stars and Bars, looked so ridiculously similar to the Union's Stars and Stripes that in the smoke and chaos of battle, soldiers on both sides kept getting confused and shooting at their own men. After a particularly disastrous episode of friendly fire at the First Battle of Bull Run, General P.G.T. Beauregard demanded a new, distinct design for combat. So one of the most famous and controversial symbols in American history was created for the very practical purpose of screaming, "Hey, I'm on your team. Please stop shooting at me." 6. Before the invention of radios, armies relied on line-of-sight communication. The Union's high-tech solution was the wigwag system, a method of signaling with a single flag waved in complex patterns based on a cipher. It was revolutionary for its time, but also painfully, hilariously slow. Transmitting a single, simple sentence could take an eternity, with a signalman on a hilltop frantically waving a flag around like he was trying to fend off an attack by invisible, angry hornets. By the time you signaled, "Send reinforcements, we are under attack," the battle was probably already over and the survivors were busy trading for coffee. 7. To bombard the city of Charleston from a distance, Union engineers decided to undertake a Herculean task, placing a massive 8-ton cannon in the middle of a swamp. They spent weeks building an enormous wooden platform to support the beast. It worked for a little while. On its 36th shot, the cannon, nicknamed the Swamp Angel, didn't just break. The recoil was so immense it shattered its own mounting, broke through the platform, and spectacularly plunged into the swampy muck where it remains to this day. It was a perfect, self-sinking monument to military overconfidence and the eternal battle of heavy objects versus mud. 8. In a move of ultimate rebellionception, the county of Jones in Mississippi reportedly seceded from the Confederacy itself. Led by a poor farmer named Newton Knight, a rugged band of Confederate deserters and anti-secessionists formed the Free State of Jones. They declared their loyalty to the Union and waged a fierce guerrilla war against Confederate authorities from within the swamps and piney woods. They were a tiny pro-Union republic deep inside enemy territory, creating a bizarre civil war within the Civil War. It was like getting divorced from your spouse while you're already at your divorce lawyer's office to divorce the country. 9. History has a twisted sense of humor, and nowhere is that clearer than the Battle of Palmito Ranch in Texas. It was fought on May 13, 1865, more than a month after General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, and the war was, for all intents and purposes, over. News traveled slow in the 19th century, and these isolated troops on the frontier simply hadn't gotten the memo. So they fought a bloody, entirely pointless battle where men were killed for a cause that no longer existed. The final, bitter irony? The Confederates, whose nation had already dissolved, actually won this last meaningless battle. Because of course they did. 10. But the story gets even weirder. The Confederate warship CSS Shenandoah was busy raiding Union whaling ships in the remote waters of the Arctic Ocean. With no access to Twitter or telegraphs, they were completely oblivious to the fact that the war had ended. They continued their mission for months, firing the final, confirmed shot of the war on June 22, 1865, near the Bering Strait. They only learned the war was over in August when they encountered a British vessel. The captain then disguised the ship and sailed all the way to Liverpool to surrender, completing a full circumnavigation of the globe as a warship without a country to report to. 11. During a surprise nighttime attack on a Union supply train, a unit of Confederate soldiers accidentally stumbled upon a massive encampment of Union mules. The ensuing chaos of gunfire and shouting spooked the animals, and hundreds of them stampeded in the dark, thundering directly toward the Confederate lines. The Confederates, hearing the terrifying noise of hundreds of hooves and ungodly braying, were utterly convinced they were being charged by a massive force of enemy cavalry. They broke ranks and fled in abject terror from an army of angry, weaponized donkeys. 12. Soldiers are still people, and people need their vices. On the quieter fronts of the war, an unspoken rule of commerce often emerged between the front lines. Union and Confederate pickets, stationed on opposite sides of a river, would declare unofficial truces to trade. The deal was simple. The Union troops had plenty of coffee but no tobacco, and the Confederates had plenty of tobacco but no coffee. They'd send little makeshift rafts or toy boats across the river to exchange goods, becoming business partners for a few hours before going back to being mortal enemies. 13. In the dead of winter in 1864, a small snowball fight erupted between two Texan brigades in the Confederate Army. But this wasn't just fun and games. It quickly escalated into a full-scale, organized battle. Because what else are you supposed to do during a war? Obviously, a snowball fight. Officers took command, ordering frontal assaults and flanking maneuvers. They used blankets to capture prisoners. The fight raged all day, and by the end, there were real casualties, including black eyes, broken noses, and at least one soldier who was knocked unconscious. It was less a snowball fight and more a military operation with frozen ammunition. 14. The primary food source for a Union soldier was hardtack, a simple flour and water biscuit baked until it achieved the density of a ceramic tile. It was famously indestructible. Soldiers joked that the biscuits were better used as shingles for a roof or as projectiles for a slingshot. The only way to make it edible was to soak it in coffee for half an hour to soften it up or smash it into powder with a rifle butt. And even then, you had to contend with the weevils living inside, which soldiers grimly referred to as additional protein that added a bit of a wiggle to their meal. 15. When coffee supplies inevitably ran low, the Union Army's official manuals had a solution straight out of a survivalist's nightmare. Make your own coffee from dandelion roots. The official recipe involved digging up the common weeds, washing the roots, roasting them until they were dark brown, and then grinding them into a foul-tasting powder. It was a testament to human desperation and the Army's unwavering belief that soldiers would drink literally anything as long as you called it coffee. Spoiler alert, it tasted exactly like you'd expect roasted weeds to taste, like bitter dirt and shattered dreams. 16. 19th century medicine was a minefield of bad ideas, but one of the most pervasive was the fear of night air. Both Union and Confederate armies believed that miasma, or bad vapors rising from the ground at night, caused diseases like malaria and dysentery. As a result, even on sweltering southern nights, soldiers were ordered to keep their tents sealed shut. This created a suffocating, unhygienic hotbox that was actually a perfect breeding ground for lice, germs, and the very diseases they were trying to prevent. Their cure was literally making them sicker, one sweaty night at a time. 17. The official Union Army knapsack was a monument to useless bureaucracy and a source of constant misery for the soldiers. It was filled with regulation items that were heavy and almost entirely impractical for field combat, including a full dress coat for parades, special kits for polishing brass buttons, and pristine white gloves. Soldiers were subjected to the hated knapsack drill, where they had to lay out all this junk for inspection. The first thing any veteran soldier did was secretly throw away half of the contents to lighten their load, hoping the inspecting officer wouldn't notice their lack of button polishing equipment. 18. During the Battle of Gettysburg, Union troops captured a stray dog who was the beloved mascot of a Confederate regiment. Instead of just adopting him, they formally declared him a prisoner of war. This led to one of the most surreal exchanges in military history. The dog was eventually traded back to the Confederates. The price? The release of a captured Union soldier. I'm not saying it makes sense, I'm just saying it happened. For one brief, glorious moment, the official military value of this one good boy was equal to that of a human soldier, all confirmed with official paperwork. 19. In the middle of a frantic cavalry battle, Union forces completely overran the Confederate camp's kitchens. The smell of frying bacon and boiling coffee proved to be a more powerful force than military discipline. The starving Union troopers literally stopped fighting to raid the enemy's breakfast. For a few bizarre minutes, the sounds of battle were replaced by the sounds of men fighting over biscuits and hot coffee. Actual, real food. Not the tooth-shattering, weevil-infested hardtack they'd been chipping away at for months. After months of that, you'd probably charge hell itself for a piece of bacon. 20. In 1864, in the middle of a brutal war that threatened to tear the country apart forever, the United States held a full presidential election. The logistics were a complete circus. States had to pass special laws to allow soldiers to vote from the front lines. Commissioners were sent into the trenches with ballot boxes. Imagine being caked in mud, having just survived a firefight, only to be handed a ballot and told to perform your civic duty. It was a chaotic, surreal, and uniquely American spectacle of insisting on democracy, even in the most insane of circumstances. 21. Abraham Lincoln's first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, was so spectacularly corrupt he became a legend in his own time. He handed out lucrative contracts to his political cronies, who then supplied the Union Army with completely useless equipment at inflated prices. This included rifles that were known to explode in soldiers' faces, uniforms made of shoddy, recycled wool that disintegrated in the rain, and horses that were sick or lame. He wasn't just managing a war, he was running the world's most dangerous and inefficient garage sale, and Lincoln finally had to get rid of him by appointing him ambassador to Russia. 22. By 1863, the Confederate home front was starving, and patience was wearing thin. In the capital of Richmond, hundreds of women, furious at the astronomical price of bread and other goods, started a massive riot. They weren't just protesting, they were armed with axes, knives, and pistols. They smashed their way into shops and warehouses, liberating food, clothing, and supplies. The riot was so out of control that Confederate President Jefferson Davis himself had to come out onto the street and personally confront the mob, emptying his own pockets and pleading with them to stop before they toppled his government over groceries. 23. The Medal of Honor is America's highest award for military valor. But during the Civil War, the rules for awarding it were a bit loose. In the most absurd example, nearly the entire 27th Maine Infantry Regiment, over 300 men, were awarded the Medal of Honor. Their incredible act of bravery? Their term of enlistment was up right before a major battle, and they all agreed to stay on for a few extra days to help defend Washington, D.C. They were given the nation's highest honor essentially for not going home on time. It was a medal for signing paperwork. 24. Georgia's governor, Joseph E. Brown, was such a fanatical believer in states' rights that he essentially waged his own private war against the Confederate government he was supposed to be a part of. He refused to let Georgia's troops be commanded by non-Georgians, hoarded crucial supplies like blankets and weapons for his own state's militia, and constantly argued with Jefferson Davis over military strategy. It was a bizarre case of a state trying to have its cake and secede from it too, creating a rebellion inside a rebellion. 25. In 1862, a wild rumor spread through the Confederate capital of Richmond that a large Union cavalry force was about to attack the city. The panic was so immediate and so total that the entire Confederate Congress, along with other high-ranking government officials, scrambled aboard a train and began a full-scale evacuation. They were fleeing in terror from an enemy that didn't exist. The cavalry was a phantom, which, by the way, probably would have been stopped by Wilmer McLean's cursed living room anyway. The government of the Confederacy had just shown the world they'd run from a ghost story. 26. The border town of Romney, in what is now West Virginia, holds the unenviable record for being the most captured town of the war. It changed hands an incredible 56 times. Its citizens would go to bed with the Union in control and wake up to find the Confederates marching down the street, and vice versa. Loyalty became a dangerous survival game where you had to quickly figure out which flag was flying that particular morning before you opened your mouth. It must have been exhausting just keeping track of who you were supposed to be cheering for, let alone who owned your town that day. 27. The Confederate economy was pure, unregulated chaos. Not only did the central government print money, but so did individual states, and cities, and counties, and railroad companies, and private banks and insurance firms. A soldier might be paid in dollars that were only good in Virginia, while a shopkeeper 2 towns over would only accept dollars issued by the Bank of East Tennessee. It was a financial nightmare where every single transaction was a gamble on whose colorful piece of paper was less worthless that day. You practically needed a degree in economics just to buy a potato. 28. Under the Union's Enrollment Act of 1863, a man who was drafted to fight could legally avoid service in one of 2 ways: pay a hefty commutation fee, or more commonly, hire a substitute to fight in his place. This spawned a sleazy and exploitative industry of substitute brokers who would find poor immigrants or desperate young men, pay them a small fraction of the official fee to enlist, and then pocket the rest of the cash. It was a deeply cynical system where the nation's wealthiest men could pay the poorest to go and die for them, all perfectly legal. 29. In one of history's most cruelly ironic twists, the legislation creating the United States Secret Service was approved on April 14, 1865. Abraham Lincoln was shot later that same night. The agency that would one day be famous for taking a bullet for the president was essentially born about 5 hours too late to help its own creator. To add another layer of irony, its original mission wasn't even presidential protection. It was to hunt the rampant counterfeiters who were wrecking the nation's economy. 30. Union General Alfred N.A. Duffier was once found during a heated battle while his men were being cut to pieces, allegedly passed out completely drunk under a tree. His incompetence and reported inebriation were so blatant and so dangerous to his own troops that he was arrested by his own side, mid-battle, and officially relieved of his command. It's one thing to be a bad general. It's another thing entirely to be so bad at your job that you get fired while the battle is still going on around you. 31. When Union General Benjamin Butler took control of New Orleans, he was infuriated by the city's women, who would constantly insult, spit at, and dump trash on his soldiers. He issued his infamous Woman Order, declaring that any woman caught disrespecting a Union soldier would be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation, in other words, a prostitute. This caused an international scandal, and the women of New Orleans got the last laugh by printing his face on the bottom of their chamber pots, a truly personal form of protest. 32. One of the very first land battles of the war was so incredibly one-sided that it was forever nicknamed the Philippi Races. A small, completely unprepared Confederate force was totally surprised by a Union attack at dawn. They immediately broke and ran in what was described by witnesses as a full-blown sprint for the hills. The retreat was so panicked and disorganized that it barely qualified as a battle at all. It was more like the chaotic start of a marathon where everyone is running in the same direction, away from the guys with guns. 33. The Union Army's bureaucracy was a beautiful, terrible force of nature. To report a lost or stolen mule, an officer couldn't just say, "Hey, we lost a mule." He had to fill out a mind-numbing 3-page document called Form 18, Return of Quartermaster's Stores. It required excruciating detail about the mule's age, color, branding, and the exact circumstances of its disappearance, complete with witness signatures. In a war with thousands of human casualties a day, the paperwork for one single donkey was a top priority. 34. At one point during the Vicksburg campaign, Union ships guarding a river spotted what they believed was a new, sinister-looking Confederate ironclad warship floating towards them in the dead of night. They immediately panicked and opened fire with every cannon they had, blasting the mysterious vessel with a furious barrage. After wasting a tremendous amount of precious ammunition, the smoke cleared to reveal their terrifying enemy, a few empty barrels and a log that had been nailed together by a clever Union admiral upstream to fool the enemy downstream. It worked a little too well on his own navy. 35. On the eve of one engagement, a stray pig wandered into the no-man's land between the two armies. A few Confederate soldiers decided to liberate it for their dinner. The Union soldiers saw this and claimed the pig rightfully belonged to them. After months of hardtack, the sight of fresh pork was enough to make soldiers forget what war they were fighting. A small skirmish broke out over ownership of the pig. The pig war became so intense that officers had to arrange a temporary ceasefire to sort out the pork situation before the real battle could begin. 36. By the end of the war, Confederate currency had undergone such massive hyperinflation that it had become virtually worthless. A soldier's entire monthly pay couldn't even buy a single loaf of bread in Richmond. The money was so useless that people found a new, more practical use for the beautifully engraved but valueless banknotes. They used them as wallpaper. People would literally plaster the walls of their homes with money that was cheaper to use as decoration than actual paper. It was the ultimate symbol of a failed economy. 37. Confederate General James Longstreet was a brilliant commander, but he had a strange obsession with military simplicity. He despised the flashy, ornate uniforms that many high-ranking officers loved to wear. He issued a strict order banning gold lace and elaborate braids on his officers' uniforms. He even made them replace their shiny brass buttons with plain, unremarkable ones made of bone or wood. In his army, you could always spot an officer because he was the one who looked less fancy and more annoyed than the regular soldiers. 38. The legendary Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was a military genius, but he was also profoundly eccentric. He was completely convinced that one of his arms was heavier than the other, so he would often hold it raised straight up in the air for long periods, believing it would restore the balance of his blood. He also believed lemons were a cure-all for indigestion and would constantly suck on them, even in the middle of a battle. His troops revered him as a brilliant leader who was also, just maybe, a little bit crazy. 39. Before a major battle in Tennessee, the opposing generals, Union General William Rosecrans and Confederate General Braxton Bragg, found their armies facing each other across a river. According to some accounts, they began a bizarrely courteous exchange of notes via messengers under flags of truce. Instead of threats, their messages were almost like two business partners scheduling a meeting, politely inquiring about each other's intentions and readiness to begin the engagement. It was a surreal moment of gentlemanly etiquette before ordering thousands of men to attack each other. 40. The Union Navy developed a fleet of Revolutionary River ironclads, officially called City-class gunboats, but universally known as pook turtles, due to their sloped, shell-like armor. They were fearsome in a fight against Confederate forts, but they had a critical design flaw. They were barely seaworthy. Their front armor was so heavy that in choppy water or even just heavy rain, they were in constant danger of taking on water over the bow and sinking nose first. For the crews of these iron monsters, a bad thunderstorm was often scarier than a Confederate cannon. 41. In the midst of fighting a war for the nation's soul, some high-ranking Union generals became obsessed with a different, more personal enemy: facial hair. Believing that clean-shaven faces promoted discipline and hygiene, they issued official orders forcing soldiers to shave their beloved beards. This was met with outrage from veterans who had cultivated magnificent beards over years of service as a mark of pride and manliness. It was a bizarre crusade against whiskers, because why fight the enemy when you can fight your own soldiers' grooming preferences? 42. Abraham Lincoln was a hands-on commander-in-chief, especially when it came to new military technology. He wasn't content to just read reports. He wanted to see the hardware in action. This led to the surreal sight of the President of the United States standing on the White House lawn and personally test-firing new models of rifles and carbines. He would set up targets against a pile of lumber and blast away, sometimes dangerously close to the Treasury building. It was a one-man arms expo hosted by the most powerful man in the country. 43. The Confederacy had a top-secret plan to sow terror and chaos in the North. Use a mysterious chemical weapon called Greek fire to burn down New York City. Their agents smuggled the volatile liquid into hotels across Manhattan in suitcases. The reality, however, was a pathetic, comical failure. Instead of creating a massive inferno, the chemicals just fizzled, sputtered, and created a lot of foul-smelling smoke, barely managing to singe a few curtains and carpets. One of the war's most ambitious terror plots ended not with a bang, but with a sad, smoky whimper. 44. In late 1863, thousands of veteran Union soldiers did the unthinkable. They went on strike. Their 3-year enlistments were up, and they refused to re-enlist or perform their duties until they received their back pay and bonuses. Not in government bonds, but in cold, hard cash. So, right before a major campaign against Robert E. Lee, a huge chunk of the Army's battle-hardened corps literally stacked their rifles and held the Union hostage for a paycheck. Panicking, the War Department had to rush wagons loaded with hundreds of thousands of dollars to the front lines, like a mob movie payoff. Once every man was paid, they picked up their guns and went back to being heroes. It wasn't treason, it was simply the most effective and most heavily armed labor negotiation in American history. And that, folks, was America's most absurd 4-year camping trip with bayonets. A saga of bad ideas, bizarre luck, and weaponized mules. But this can't be the peak of historical madness. So I need to know, what's the single dumbest decision you've ever heard of from any point in history? A war started over a bucket? A king who died on the toilet? Drop your favorite historical fails in the comments, smash that like, and subscribe like you're about to storm a breakfast tent for bacon.